My name is Walter Merrick. I am 81 years old, and these days I live alone in a modest two-bedroom house, tucked away in a sleepy cul-de-sac in Rocklin, California. The walls are painted a shade of beige that seems to turn golden in the late afternoon sun. Though most days I draw the curtains before it gets that far. It's not that I dislike the light, it's just that it reminds me of too many things I no longer have. And the warm glow that used to mean comfort now simply casts long shadows across an otherwise empty room. My wife, Eleanor, passed away 9 years ago, just after our 49th wedding anniversary. It was a quiet death, a stroke while she was baking bread, something she did every Saturday morning. I found her on the kitchen floor with flour on her sleeves and the oven timer still ticking. The paramedics told me she wouldn't have known what happened. They always say that. I remember thinking I should have died first. She was the kinder one. She understood people. I understood rules and routines. In her absence, I still cling to both, but with less conviction. My daughter Emma visits sporadically, though lately, sporadically has turned into only when she needs something. She's 48 now, and for reasons I've never fully grasped, she's grown into a woman I barely recognize. When she was little, I was the one who brushed her hair before school while Eleanor packed her lunch. I was the one who stayed up late helping her study for spelling bees and drove her to violin lessons. Somewhere between her graduation and her second child, she began treating me more like a cautious obligation than a parent. Maybe it started when Eleanor passed. Maybe before. It's hard to pinpoint when someone starts slipping away, especially when they're smiling at you through every stage of it. She married Jason, a man I initially thought was too eager to please. Now I know he was just rehearsing indifference. Jason is one of those men who smile with their teeth, but never with their eyes. The kind who shake your hand firmly, yet pull away too quickly as if the contact burns. He sells something. I'm not entirely sure what. The job changes every few years, but the posture stays the same. He calls me sir and says it like he's speaking to an answering machine. Their children, my grandchildren, are named Abby and Derek. Lovely kids from what I remember, but I haven't seen them in nearly 2 years. They're always busy. Always a recital, a science fair, a friend's birthday party, and when they do visit, they come with their eyes glued to glowing screens and leave before I can remember the color of their eyes. I was a school teacher for 36 years, mostly 10th grade literature. I taught Hemingway and Faulkner and Steinbeck to generations of teenagers who, in most cases, couldn't have cared less. But every now and then, there was a student who sat up straighter, asked real questions, scribbled down quotes in the margins of their notebooks. Those kids made it worth it. I wasn't the kind of teacher who gave out candy or told jokes to win affection. I believed in clarity, in the weight of words, in the value of effort. Retirement came abruptly. One day I was lecturing about symbolism in Of Mice and Men, and the next I was giving back my classroom keys and walking to my car with a cardboard box. They threw a small party in the faculty lounge with carrot cake and paper hats. That was 13 years ago. Since then, my days have followed a reliable rhythm. I wake up at 6:30, make my coffee with the same ratio Eleanor once insisted on, 3 tablespoons per cup, no more, no less, toast an English muffin, and sit by the kitchen window watching the neighbor's dog dig in the flower beds. After breakfast, I read the paper. I used to read it with a red pen in hand, underlining things I found poorly written or inaccurate, a habit I haven't quite shaken. By 10, I've usually cleaned the dishes, checked the mailbox, and perhaps watered the rose bushes in the front yard, if the heat isn't unbearable. Then comes the long stretch of empty time until evening, filled with puzzles, radio shows, and the occasional walk if my knees allow it. Some days I don't speak a word to another person until the sun has set. Some days I don't speak at all. Lately I've started forgetting small things, where I left my glasses, the names of old colleagues, the day of the week, but never the big ones. I never forget Eleanor's voice, or the way Emma looked when she won her first spelling bee, or how quiet the house became after the funeral. I still keep Eleanor's robe hanging on the back of the bathroom door. It smells like lavender and a little like thyme. I tell myself it's just for comfort, but I know it's because I haven't learned how to let go. A few months ago, I fell in the garden while trying to trim the hedges. Nothing dramatic, just a misstep, a bad angle, and down I went. I lay there for 20 minutes staring at the clouds, waiting for someone to pass by. No one did. I eventually dragged myself inside and called Emma, but she didn't answer. I didn't tell her when she called back 3 days later. What would have been the point? I told myself it was just a moment, a small slip. But something shifted after that. The world felt heavier. The stairs seemed steeper, doors harder to open. I stopped gardening. I moved my bedroom to the first floor. I began to fear the idea of needing help, not because I was ashamed, but because I knew the kind of help I would receive would come with conditions, with paperwork, with whispers behind my back. When Emma did visit last week, she seemed unusually cheerful. She brought me new slippers and my favorite ginger cookies. Jason stayed in the car, engine running. She spoke of rest, of me needing to take better care of myself. She mentioned a change of scenery. I didn't ask what she meant. It was easier that way. But I saw it in her eyes, that flicker of resolve, the same look she had when she was 9, and decided to shave the family cat. Emma, when she makes up her mind, does not unmake it. I know her well enough to see when a decision has been made, even if the words haven't followed. And so I wait. I wait for the next visit, the next phone call, the next decision made in my absence. I wait to find out whether I am still a person or already a problem to be solved. At 81, you don't really expect surprises anymore, but you still fear them. You fear being put somewhere you can't leave. You fear becoming someone people whisper about rather than speak to. You fear, most of all, the realization that you were never really seen, only tolerated. You live your whole life trying to be useful, only to be reduced, in the end, to a name on a schedule and a pillbox on a shelf. You don't think it will happen to you, until it does, until it's your turn. And now, I have the sinking feeling that my turn is coming. It began on a Wednesday morning in mid-September, one of those crisp California days when the light seems thinner and the air smells faintly of dust and citrus. I had been feeling a dull ache in my right hip for weeks, the kind of discomfort you chalk up to age and ignore because complaining won't fix anything. That morning, I bent down to pick up the paper from the porch, same as always. But when I tried to stand back up, something gave out. A sharp, searing bolt shot down my side, and I fell, hard, onto the steps. The paper tumbled beside me, fluttering open to the obituary page. I don't remember if I cried out. There was no one around to hear it if I did. I lay there for what felt like an hour, but was probably closer to 10 minutes, trying to assess whether I could crawl to the phone inside. I couldn't. My legs wouldn't cooperate, and every breath felt like I was inhaling hot iron. Eventually, I managed to pull the phone out of the robe pocket I thankfully had on. I called 911, and my voice surprised me. It sounded hoarse, unfamiliar, like gravel poured from an old jar. The operator stayed on the line until the ambulance arrived, though I barely remember the ride. I recall only the ceiling lights passing above me like blinking stars, the antiseptic smell that filled my nostrils, and the paramedic's voice saying something about a probable fracture. At the hospital, they confirmed it. A fractured femoral neck, a bad one. Surgery was required immediately. I remember the nurse, a young man named Dale, asking if I had family he should notify. I gave him Emma's number, even as I felt a tremor of hesitation. He thanked me, left the room, and within half an hour, Emma was there. She walked into the recovery room with Jason in tow, both of them dressed like they had come from a business meeting. She didn't cry, didn't gasp, just frowned slightly and came to the side of my bed. "Oh, Dad," she said, her tone hovering somewhere between concern and inconvenience. Jason stood at the foot of the bed, arms folded, eyes scanning the monitor as if it were a stock ticker. Emma squeezed my hand briefly, told me not to worry, that everything would be fine, that they'd stay nearby for a few days while I got my bearings. At first I was grateful. It felt like perhaps, just perhaps, the fall had jolted something in them, an old memory of obligation, or better yet, affection. They brought me a few of my belongings, slippers, my robe, Eleanor's photo in a small silver frame. Jason arranged for a private room and mentioned something about using points from his travel rewards program. Emma sat beside me and read aloud from the newspaper, just like Eleanor used to. I was groggy from the medication, but I remember thinking maybe I had misjudged them. Maybe they just needed a reminder. Maybe this accident would bring us closer. Hope is a funny thing. It slips in when you least expect it and sits quietly until it's proven foolish. The shift came quickly. On the third morning, I woke up to find Emma wasn't in the room. I waited through breakfast, thinking she had gone to get coffee. By noon, when neither she nor Jason had appeared, I started to worry. I called her cell. No answer. I called again. Voicemail. By late afternoon, the nurse came in with a folded note. "Your daughter left this for you," she said, then added in a tone meant to be soothing. She said it was important. The handwriting on the note was Emma's, meticulous and rounded, just like when she was 12 and wrote me thank you cards. But the words were curt. "Dad, we had to leave for a much-needed vacation. You'll be safe here, don't worry. Take this time to rest. We'll be back in 2 weeks. Love, Emma." No explanation, no address, no emergency contact, just that. I read the note 3 times, hoping it would change, hoping there was more on the back, some clue that this was a joke, or a test, or even a misunderstanding. But it wasn't. They were gone, and they had left me here, alone, freshly post-op, still in pain, with no plan, no timeline, no sense of who to call if something went wrong. I asked the nurse if they had said where they were going. She shook her head. They just mentioned they'd be unreachable for a while. "International, maybe?" she said with a shrug. "But don't worry, we'll take good care of you." That phrase, "we'll take good care of you," landed in my chest like a hammer wrapped in gauze. I've heard it before. It's the phrase people say before they hand you over to strangers in uniforms who call you by your last name and speak to you like a child. It's the phrase people use when they're washing their hands of you. I didn't know how to respond. I didn't want to cause a scene, and what could I do anyway? My leg was stapled shut, my mobility reduced to a walker I could barely reach without assistance. So I thanked the nurse and said I was tired. And when she left, I stared at the ceiling for hours, listening to the hum of the fluorescent lights, trying to remember the last time my daughter hugged me without obligation. That night, a social worker came to visit. Her name was Marlene, a soft-spoken woman in her 60s with tired eyes and a clipboard she held like a shield. She explained that Emma had requested a temporary guardianship arrangement so that decisions could be made without delays. The paperwork, she assured me, was standard and reversible. I asked if I had signed anything. She said not yet. That word, yet, struck me. It implied a trajectory I hadn't agreed to. She left the forms with me and asked me to think it over. The next day, I overheard 2 nurses talking outside my door. "His daughter said he's been getting forgetful," one said. "Might be early onset." "Yeah," the other replied. "She mentioned he left the stove on last month. Nearly burned the house down." I wanted to scream. I wanted to call them in and demand where they got that information. Who told them that lie? But I stayed quiet. I couldn't risk sounding irrational. That would only help their case. I spent the rest of the day turning the note over in my hand, again and again, the edges softening, the ink smudging. The betrayal wasn't loud. It didn't shout or slap. It whispered, slowly and insidiously. It said, "You're not worth delaying a vacation for. You're not someone we stay behind for. You're just an inconvenience now." That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared at Eleanor's photo on the nightstand and whispered, "They left me, Ellie. They left me like an unwanted suitcase on a station platform." The only response was the soft beep of the heart monitor and the distant echo of another patient groaning down the hall. I didn't cry. Not then. But something broke. Quietly. Irreparably. And I knew, without a doubt, that whatever came next would not be about healing. It would be about reclaiming, about taking back what they thought they could quietly erase. I didn't know how yet, but I knew this. I wouldn't let their silence be the last word. The hospital days that followed were marked not by physical pain, which the medication kept at bay, but by a slow, creeping disorientation, like standing still while the world subtly rearranged itself around you. I wasn't dying, not even close, and yet everyone treated me as if I were no longer quite present. Nurses spoke louder than necessary, using short words, over-explaining basic things, as if I were suddenly too fragile to understand the passage of time or the functions of a call button. When they wheeled me to physical therapy, the attendant would smile too much, ask condescending questions like, "Did we get enough rest last night, Mr. Merrick?" As if I had been 10 years old, and she a patient kindergarten teacher. I swallowed my pride and nodded, but inside I was boiling. The more I tried to assert normalcy, asking for newspapers, requesting my reading glasses, attempting to handle my own hygiene, the more I noticed the quiet resistance around me. One nurse even removed my shaving kit from the bathroom, citing safety concerns, and insisted I use hospital razors under supervision. I hadn't used a disposable razor in 40 years. My face began to look like someone else's, someone weaker. Each morning, the same small television flickered in the corner of my room with talk shows and pharmaceutical commercials. I kept it on for noise more than anything. Silence, in those days, had a weight that pressed on my lungs. Marlene, the social worker, continued to stop by every couple of days. Each visit, she grew slightly firmer in tone, less concerned with how I felt, and more concerned with whether I had signed the guardianship papers Emma left behind. "You don't have to sign today, of course," she would say, "but the sooner we can finalize this, the better for your care continuity." Her phrasing was always precise, rehearsed. I asked what exactly Emma had told her. "Just that you've had some trouble keeping track of things at home. There was a stove incident, apparently, and confusion with your medications." I told her those things weren't true, and she wrote something down on her clipboard without looking me in the eye. That was the moment I began to truly understand the shape of the problem. Not only was I alone, but I was alone within a story someone else had written about me. One in which I was no longer capable, no longer trustworthy, no longer allowed to speak on my own behalf. I was a character being managed, a liability with sentimental value. I called Emma's number repeatedly, no answer, straight to voicemail. Jason's phone did the same. I left messages at first, then stopped. What was I supposed to say? "Please remember, I'm your father?" The thought of begging made my skin crawl. I even tried texting Abby and Derek, though I didn't expect an answer. I didn't get one. I told myself they were young, busy, distracted, but deep down I knew that was no longer the whole truth. Their distance wasn't accidental. It had been taught, modeled, passed down from their parents. They had learned without being told that I was a man to be tolerated on holidays, remembered in Christmas cards, but not someone who mattered when choices had to be made. One afternoon, while flipping through the hospital's in-room information folder, I noticed an unsigned directive listing Jason as my medical proxy. That document hadn't existed before. I had never consented to it. I buzzed the nurse, asked who had added it. She seemed flustered, said it must have come from the family. I demanded to see the original. Later that day, Marlene returned with a copy, smiling that same bureaucratic smile. "It was submitted last week," she said. I looked at the signature line. It was my name, in handwriting that resembled mine, but slanted strangely, as if someone had practiced copying it too many times. "I never signed this," I said, my voice rising despite myself. "This is a forgery." Marlene blinked again, then scribbled on her clipboard. "I understand," she said flatly. "But unless we have a legal challenge, this remains in effect." I lay awake that night staring at the ceiling tiles, feeling my heart thudding like a drum inside my chest. Not out of fear exactly, but fury. They had forged my signature. They had named Jason, as the person responsible for my health. A man who hadn't looked me in the eyes in 5 years was now in a position to make decisions about my life and death. What was next? Selling the house? Freezing my accounts? Declaring me unfit? I realized that I was being slowly erased, not with malice exactly, but with the quiet efficiency of people who considered me already gone, a burden to be managed, a problem to solve behind closed doors. That was when the decision crystallized inside me like ice forming on glass. I had to get out of that hospital. I had to reclaim whatever was left of my autonomy before it became a memory. The next morning, I called Alan Sherman, an old friend and former colleague who had retired from practicing law several years back. We hadn't spoken in a while, but he answered on the second ring. I told him everything in careful detail. He listened without interrupting, then said quietly, "That's elder abuse, Walt. It's real, and it's happening more and more, but we can fight it. First, we need to get you assessed by an independent physician. Then we'll revoke any unauthorized documents and secure power of attorney back in your name. Can you hold on for a few days?" I said I could. I told no one about the call. Over the next week, I began documenting everything. I kept a small notepad under my pillow and jotted down every interaction, every name, every detail I could recall about Emma and Jason's actions. I wrote down the date I was left alone, the time of the nurse's visit, the words used by Marlene, the strange behavior of staff. I even wrote about the way other patients looked at me, how some of them, though more infirm than I, received flowers, visits, laughter, attention. I had nothing but silence and the fading echo of a family I thought I still had. On the 7th day after the surgery, I was discharged. Not into a rehabilitation facility, not into home care, but back to my house, alone, with a walker and a bottle of painkillers. A nurse named Cynthia drove me there in a transport van. She was kind enough, asked if I had food in the fridge. I lied and said yes. She left me with a list of emergency contacts, none of which included Emma. The moment the door shut behind me, I stood in the middle of my living room and realized I was in a house filled with traps. Stairs I could barely climb, a kitchen I couldn't cook in, bathrooms that now seemed dangerous. But it was mine, and that made all the difference. I sat in my armchair, the same one I had read stories to Emma in when she was a girl, and looked at the walls, at the photographs, at Eleanor's shawl still folded on the back of the couch. I was tired, yes, but not defeated. Somewhere inside me, the teacher in me, the man who had once explained Shakespeare's Lear to skeptical teenagers, was waking up. Betrayal, I told myself. comes not from enemies, but from those who know your name, who use it when they hurt you. And that is the hardest betrayal of all. But Lear had nothing left. I still did. I had time, I had will, and more than anything, I had the truth. And I was going to use it. The house was colder than I remembered, or maybe it was just me. Thinner, more brittle than I used to be. The heat of indignation starting to burn at a lower flame. That first evening home, I sat in silence for hours, watching the shadows move along the walls like old memories that refused to leave. Everything was exactly where I had left it. The cushion with the dent of my spine on the armchair, the bookshelf with the dog-eared copy of The Old Man and the Sea, Eleanor's teacup still hanging above the stove, as if she might walk in and fill it. But the silence now felt more threatening, like something pressing in. I hadn't heard from Emma in 10 days. Not a call, not a message. When I checked my mailbox the next morning, I found a thick envelope from a legal office I didn't recognize. Inside were documents confirming that Emma had filed a petition for permanent guardianship, citing cognitive decline and episodes of disorientation. Attached were statements from 2 individuals who claimed to have witnessed me exhibiting confusion and forgetfulness. Neither name belonged to any doctor I had ever met. One was, apparently, a neighbor. The other was an in-home nurse I had never employed. I read the papers slowly, deliberately, and when I finished, I placed them on the coffee table and just stared at them for several minutes, trying to understand how far they were willing to go. This wasn't concern. This wasn't love warped by panic. This was something colder, strategic, legal. I wasn't their father anymore. I was an asset, a risk, a thing to be managed or removed. That afternoon I called Alan again and told him about the documents. His voice was steady but sharper this time. "This changes the game," he said. "If they've filed in court, we need to respond immediately. I'll prepare a counter-petition, and I'll schedule a neuropsychological evaluation for you. We'll get a report from a licensed doctor, someone objective. But Walter, you need to be prepared. This could get ugly. If they're fabricating witnesses, they might fabricate other things too." I nodded, though he couldn't see me. "I'm prepared," I said. I'm done waiting for them to come around. The next day, I took the city bus to the nearest notary office and revoked any previously granted powers of attorney. It was difficult, boarding the bus with a walker, managing the steps, the stairs. But I did it. It took most of the morning. Then I stopped by the bank, met with the branch manager I'd known for years, and removed Emma's name from all my accounts. She had once been listed as a joint holder for convenience, but I realized now that convenience had become vulnerability. I closed the savings account she had access to, opened a new one, and transferred everything. I asked to be notified immediately if any withdrawal attempts were made using her credentials. The manager looked surprised but didn't ask questions. Perhaps she'd seen this before. Perhaps I wasn't the first. The neuropsychologist appointment was the following week. I was nervous, more than I expected to be. It wasn't that I feared the results, but the idea of sitting across from someone who could, with a few marks of a pen, decide whether my mind was still mine, whether my memories, my sense of self, my judgment were still valid, was terrifying. The doctor was younger than I expected, maybe in his 40s, with the tired eyes of someone who had heard every version of the phrase, "I'm fine," and learned not to believe it. But he was kind, methodical. We spoke for nearly 3 hours. He asked me about the date, the president, my childhood, my retirement, the fall, Emma, Eleanor. I told him everything. He listened carefully, took notes, made me do memory games and logic puzzles, read me stories, and asked questions about them. At the end of the session, he shook my hand and said, "I see no cognitive impairment, Mr. Merrick. You're sharp, angry, but sharp. I chuckled at that. "I've earned my anger," I replied. A week later, his report was submitted to the court, along with Alan's counter-petition. We requested a hearing to challenge the guardianship and to investigate the validity of the documents Emma had filed. We also included a motion to obtain surveillance footage from the hospital for the dates in question, to prove that no such nurse had ever visited me. Alan assured me that if we could poke even one hole in their claims, the entire petition would begin to collapse. Still, I felt a growing anxiety as the date approached. I began to check the locks twice before bed, to scan through my old documents and mail for anything they might have manipulated. I even stopped answering unknown numbers. The trust I had once extended so easily to my daughter had curdled into suspicion, and that feeling, more than the pain in my hip, more than the surgical scar, was what truly told me I had entered a different stage of life, one where your name alone is no longer enough to protect you, one where blood ties don't guarantee decency. I didn't sleep the night before the hearing. I sat by the window, the old one in the living room that looked out over the empty cul-de-sac, and watched the streetlights flicker against the pavement. A neighbor's cat crossed the road slowly, unconcerned. The world outside was unchanged, peaceful, while my world inside was tightening like a vice. I looked at the framed photo of Eleanor on the mantel and said aloud, "They thought I wouldn't fight." And in that moment, I wasn't afraid. I wasn't even tired. I was just ready. Ready to speak, to defend, to reclaim, not just my legal rights, but the version of myself they had tried to write out of the story. The courtroom was colder than I expected, not just from the air conditioning that hummed above like a distant drone, but from the silence that settled around me the moment I was wheeled in. I say wheeled in because Alan insisted on bringing a transport chair, worried that the slow, halting gait of my healing hip would be misinterpreted as further frailty. I hated that chair. It wasn't pain that put me in it. It was optics, image, strategy. The way I looked had suddenly become more important than who I was. Alan pushed me through the hallway past strangers in suits, some typing on phones, others shuffling paper. I didn't recognize the woman who stood beside Emma, but I assumed she was the lawyer, young, confident, polished, in the way people are when they think the facts are already in their favor. Jason sat behind them in the gallery row, arms crossed, his eyes darting toward me briefly before looking away. I don't think he expected me to be there. Not really. I think, deep down, he believed I'd fade away quietly, swallowed by the red tape and the weight of their false kindness. But I hadn't. And I was here. The hearing was brief, as these things go. Alan spoke with clarity and restraint, laying out the timeline of events, the contradictions in the filed documents, the lack of legitimate witnesses, the forged signature. He presented the neuropsychological report in careful detail, emphasizing phrases like fully competent, no signs of cognitive deterioration, and able to manage own affairs. I sat there watching Emma's face, hoping for something, regret, shame, even anger, but she kept the same tight-lipped expression, eyes forward, only blinking when Alan said the word forgery. Jason looked more rattled than she did. At one point, he leaned in and whispered something to her, but she didn't respond. When their lawyer spoke, she did so with practiced concern, suggesting that while Emma may have been overzealous, her actions stemmed from a deep love and worry for her father. She cited the fall, the hospital stay, the supposed confusion during recovery, but then Alan played a video, a security clip from the hospital hallway, time-stamped, showing that no in-home nurse ever entered my room on the days in question. The judge's eyes narrowed. The courtroom was silent. The ruling was swift. The guardianship petition was denied. The forged signature was acknowledged, but Since no money had changed hands yet, the judge opted not to refer it for criminal investigation. A family matter, she said, best handled outside criminal court. I wanted to object, to demand consequences, but Alan placed a hand on my arm and gave me a look that said, "Let it go, for now." Afterward, Emma and Jason left without speaking to me. I watched them walk down the hallway, their steps brisk, almost defiant. I wondered what they would tell the children, that their grandfather had gone mad, that he had turned on them, or perhaps worst of all, that none of this had happened at all. The next week, I filed a formal motion to challenge all remaining access Emma had to my financial accounts, pension, insurance, and medical records. Alan helped me draw up letters to each institution, enclosing the court's ruling and instructions to consider any future contact from Emma as unauthorized. I reopened my safe and checked the house deed, mortgage records, and insurance policies. Everything was still intact, but it struck me how easy it would have been to lose all of it, how close I had come to being erased. That realization didn't leave me for days. I'd walk from room to room in my home, touching furniture, opening drawers, as if reassuring myself that these things were still mine, that my life hadn't yet been fully rewritten. And yet, part of it had. My relationship with Emma, my only child, was gone. Even if she came back tomorrow and wept apologies at my doorstep, I would never unhear her silence in the hospital. I would never forget the note she left instead of a conversation. And then something else arrived, a notice from the county clerk's office. It was about my house. A notice of intent to transfer ownership had been filed, dated during my hospital stay. It listed Jason as the proposed recipient. My signature was on the form, another forgery. I sat at the kitchen table with that notice in front of me for nearly an hour, unable to move. They had planned everything. While I lay in a hospital bed recovering from surgery, they were preparing to take the last thing I owned outright. My house. The home Eleanor and I had built together, room by room. The place where Emma had taken her first steps, where I had planted the Japanese maple that turned fire red every October. They wanted to take it from under me like a carpet pulled too fast. That day, I didn't call Alan. I didn't call anyone. I simply stood, walked slowly to the liquor cabinet I rarely opened, and poured myself a glass of scotch. I drank it without ice, the burn traveling down my chest like a match dragged along dry wood. I had tried the polite way. I had defended. Now it was time to reclaim. The next day I called a real estate attorney and explained the situation. He was cautious but helpful. We reviewed the deed together. I had inherited full ownership after Eleanor passed. No one else had claim. The transfer request was legally void without notarized consent, but the very fact that it had been filed meant they had intended to follow through. If I had died, or if the court had approved their guardianship, they would have completed the transfer. My home, my money, my history, gone with a pen stroke. It was then that I decided I wouldn't just block their access. I would strip it, remove every last thread that tied them to my life. I drafted a new will. I rewrote my power of attorney. I closed the college savings accounts I had quietly funded for Abby and Derek for years. Not $1 had ever been thanked. Not one phone call, not one birthday card. I transferred the funds into a charitable trust in Eleanor's name, one that would sponsor underprivileged students in the school district where I had taught. A part of me trembled with the finality of it all. But another part, the part that had lain helpless on cold hospital sheets while strangers whispered about my sanity, felt nothing but steel. Then came the confrontation. They returned. I don't know how they found out I had revoked everything. Perhaps the bank called them. Perhaps they tried to log into an account and failed. All I know is one afternoon, while I sat reading by the window, A black SUV pulled into the driveway. Jason stepped out first. Emma followed. She was thinner than I remembered, or maybe just older. She came up to the door and knocked, gently, as if still unsure of her standing. I opened it and said nothing. She asked to come in. I stood aside. She sat on the couch without waiting for an invitation. Jason remained standing. "We heard about the hearing," she said, "and the accounts, and the trust." I nodded. She continued. "You didn't even talk to us, Dad. You didn't give us a chance to explain." I looked at her for a long moment. "Explain what?" I asked. "That you forged my name? That you left me alone in a hospital to go wine tasting in Napa while filing petitions to take control of my life?" She flinched at that. Jason spoke up. "We were trying to protect you. You were confused. You were a fall risk. We were scared." "No," I said, my voice calm, steady. "You were opportunists, and you got caught." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "So that's it? You're cutting us off?" I shook my head. "You cut yourselves off the moment you decided I was easier to manage than to love." They didn't argue. They didn't apologize. They left. Quietly. I watched them walk back to the SUV and drive away. And when the car disappeared around the corner, I sat back down and felt, for the first time in months, peace. Not the peace of resolution, not the peace of forgiveness, but the peace of distance. The knowledge that, while I had lost something irreversible, I had also reclaimed something irreplaceable. Myself. After they left that day, after the confrontation that should have burned a hole through the floor and instead just quietly darkened the air, I didn't move from my chair for a long time. I sat by the window as dusk crawled in, feeling the weight of everything I had just said and everything I had chosen to leave unsaid. There was no victory in it, no celebration, only the dull ache of confirmation that the people I had once trusted more than anyone else had not simply made a mistake, had not merely panicked or misunderstood, but had acted with full knowledge and calculation. They had wagered that I was too old, too soft, too tired to fight back. And in doing so, they had forced me to become someone I never wanted to be. A man who had to outmaneuver his own daughter just to keep what was already his. But there was no time to linger in reflection. The motion to remove their names from any remaining property or financial entanglement was still in process, and I received notice from the bank's fraud department that an attempt had been made to withdraw funds using one of the old authorizations that thankfully had already been revoked. Alan advised me to formally press charges. He said we had enough for a case of financial elder abuse, but I declined. I told him it wasn't about punishment anymore. It was about removal, about protection, about sealing every last exit that led from their world into mine. 2 weeks later, the last legal documents were finalized. My estate had been fully restructured. My will now named no family members. The trust bearing Eleanor's name had been funded and activated. I received confirmation that all accounts were secured, all authorizations purged. I changed my phone number, updated all mailing addresses, and registered for a private mailbox service under a different name. I wasn't hiding exactly, but I was retreating. Not in defeat, but in defense of the quiet I had spent my whole life trying to preserve. Then, one Thursday morning, the final nail arrived in the form of a letter, not from Emma, but from an attorney representing her. It was a request for mediation. They wanted to discuss the emotional and financial harm caused by recent actions and reach an amicable resolution. I didn't respond. I didn't even open the full envelope. I dropped it in the shredder and watched it disappear, strip by strip, a perfect metaphor for what remained between us. There was nothing to discuss, not anymore. And yet, something still hovered over me. Not regret, not fear, but a strange kind of tension, like the final note of a song that refuses to resolve. I realized it wasn't over until I confronted the part of myself that had allowed this to happen in the first place. I had given them too much trust for too long. I had ignored the signs, softened the red flags, told myself stories about loyalty and legacy, when what I should have been paying attention to was behavior. My behavior. My complicity in the slow erosion of my own autonomy. It wasn't just Emma's fault. I had enabled her, trained her to believe I would always yield. And I had done it in the name of love. So I made one final appointment. Not with Alan, not with any court, but with a counselor. Someone outside the storm. Her name was Dr. Ling, a quiet woman in her 50s with clear eyes and the kind of silence that makes you feel listened to even before you speak. I told her everything, not just the facts, but the failures, the years of small concessions, the way I allowed myself to become a footnote in my own story. And when I was done, she didn't offer platitudes. She didn't tell me I had done the right thing or that forgiveness was the next step. She simply said, "You reclaimed your name. That matters." I nodded. It did matter, but it still hurt. The following week, I received a voicemail from Abby, my granddaughter. Her voice was careful, tentative. She said she had heard there was drama and that her mother was really upset, but that she missed me and wanted to talk. She left her number. I listened to that message 3 times. Then I deleted it. Not because I was angry, but because I knew that call wouldn't be about connection. It would be about allegiance, about trying to pull me back into the version of the family they were trying to preserve, a version where my role was to forgive and forget and fund. I wasn't ready. I may never be. Some wounds don't bleed. They calcify. Then one morning, the maple tree in the front yard began to turn. The leaves went gold first, then deep crimson, just as they always had. I stood on the porch and watched the wind shake them loose, dozens falling at once, scattering across the lawn like confetti from a celebration no one attended. That's when I knew the worst had passed, not because they had changed, not because justice had triumphed, but because I had survived it with my mind intact, my home intact, and my sense of self intact. They had tried to rewrite my ending. I had taken the pen back. It has been 3 months since I last heard Emma's voice. Longer still since I saw her face. And in that quiet stretch of time, I have come to understand the difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is what they tried to leave me with. A space of helplessness and disconnection. A waiting room for those abandoned by relevance. But solitude, I've learned, is something else entirely. It is deliberate, chosen, protected. It is waking up each morning and knowing that the silence in your home is your own, not something imposed by the absence of others, but created by the presence of yourself. I keep a different routine now. I rise later, make my coffee slower, let it cool on the windowsill while I read, not the news, not anymore, but old literature, the kind that reminds me of the words I used to teach and the man I still am. I no longer check the phone or the mailbox with expectation. There are no birthday cards now, no invitations, but there is also no pretense, no manipulation wrapped in smiles. The air is clear of that particular toxin. I have begun donating things, old suits, photo frames with pictures I no longer recognize, boxes of Emma's childhood toys that I once thought I'd pass down to Abby or Derek. I kept one item, a faded stuffed rabbit with Eleanor's handwriting stitched into the hem of its ear. Everything else went to a women's shelter downtown, a place where things get used again, where memory becomes utility. I don't do it out of bitterness. I do it because I want this house to reflect the life I live now, not the one I used to protect. Alan still calls once a week to check in. We've taken to meeting every Sunday at a quiet diner near the freeway, where we sit for hours over eggs and coffee and talk about things that have nothing to do with court documents or bank forms. We've become old men in the most ordinary and honest sense, men who have faced enough endings to know the value of beginnings. I no longer fantasize about apologies. They won't come, and I wouldn't trust them if they did. Emma made a choice. Not just once, not just in a moment of panic, but repeatedly, with deliberation, with planning. That's what I remind myself when the doubts creep in, when I wonder whether I was too harsh, whether I should have left a door open. But no. There are doors that, once sealed, must remain closed, not out of vengeance, but out of self-respect. I gave her everything I knew how to give, and she used it as scaffolding for betrayal. You don't repair from that. You rebuild elsewhere. I have written a letter to Eleanor. Not to send, of course, but to speak what I never said aloud. I told her about what happened, how it broke something sacred, how it forced me to become harder, sharper, lonelier. I also told her how I endured, how I protected the home we built, how her name now lives in a scholarship that helps children who, like her once, wanted more than they were given. I placed the letter in her old recipe box, tucked beneath the one for lemon scones. I don't read it. I don't need to. I just like knowing it's there. In the evenings, I walk slowly along the edge of the property, where the fence Eleanor painted still holds the ghost of her brushstrokes. The world continues without ceremony. Cars passing, dogs barking, distant laughter from neighbors I've never met. It's not a perfect life. It's not even a particularly joyful one, but it is mine. Undiluted, unmanipulated, and at last, uncompromised. And that, I have come to understand, is enough. They may have tried to erase me, to package me into a version of helplessness that suited their plans. But I stood back up. Not quickly, not without pain, but fully. And no matter what they say, no matter how they rewrite the story to suit their comfort, I was there. I remember. I endured. And I am still here.